Salailo Makwidiri. We're going to be kickstarting the show, I think, with a very, very important topic. I think we can all agree at this point that the issue of Gaza and the issue of Palestine should be one that we talk about on a daily basis. And as the smoke and rubble continue to blanket the Gaza Strip, whispers of a potential ceasefire between the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas, and the United States, notably excluding Israel. Indirect talks have begun to intensify on various platforms within the strategic policy circles. This morning on News and Views, we interrogate the opaque negotiations allegedly taking place between the settler colonial power and Hamas, a process being brokered bilaterally, and some say bypassing the very regime that has waged a catastrophic and genocidal war on Palestinians for 7 brutal months. This is, I think we can all agree, it's not a pathway to peace or a geopolitical sleight of hand. But what does it mean when an occupying power is circumvented in its own conflict? And crucially, who holds the leverage? The dog or the tail? Reports emerging, including insights from the media review network, suggest that Hamas may be poised to release 10 Israeli prisoners of war and 16 deceased captives, casualties of the ongoing genocide, in exchange for the freedom of thousands of Palestinian political prisoners and the entry of 1,000 humanitarian aid trucks daily into the besieged enclave. It's a deal framed by many as a humanitarian necessity and by others as political theater. What is the actual true calculus behind this proposed swap? What are some of the ethical implications that it might have? And is this really a ceasefire being negotiated under coercion, or the seeds of a longer term or a geopolitical realignment might be upon us? And joining us now to unpack these high-stake developments is Dr. Ahmed Haroon Jezabai, is a political science lecturer at UNISA. And he's also a noted researcher at the Media Review Network and one of good friends of Salam Media and the show. Doc, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure. Really, really appreciate you giving us your time.
Shukran, Salilo. Shukran for having me. Yeah,
Mm.
this is quite a strange issue because we all know over decades the power of the Zionist lobby in the United States via APAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. But we've seen over the last 2 or 3 months that this appears to be an impasse between the United States and its client state. And this, in my opinion, revolves around a misalignment between the United States' imperial ambitions in the Middle East and the Zionist entity's plans for a greater Israel. So there is a misalignment there. So this question, as was stated in the press release, whether it's the dog that wags the tail or the tail that wags the dog, is something that has been going on forever. But we've seen over the last month that the United States have bypassed Israel when it came to negotiating a ceasefire with the Houthis in Yemen, where the Houthis agreed to stop attacking American ships, but not stop attacking the Israelis, which is something we haven't heard of. We've seen the United States directly negotiate with Hamas to release the last living American hostage, Eden Alexandra. And we've also seen the United States negotiate with Iran. They're now currently in the 5th round of direct negotiations. So in the past, we would not have seen or heard about this, this misalignment. So there is a misalignment between the U.S. imperial ambitions and this ambition of Israel for the greater Israeli project. It is not as if they are, somehow at war with each other, a cold war with each other. No, when their interests align, as is the case in Egypt, in Syria, where in Syria, for example, Israel has free reign. In Lebanon, they have free reign. But this is because the interest of the United States and the interest of Israel align. But we've seen now in Gaza that these interests are not aligning. Netanyahu Trump rather is quite peeved, if I can put it that way, at Israel Netanyahu for not being able to decisively end the war. He said that this war is going on for too long, and because of this, he's quite irritated with Netanyahu. And added to that, that the United States imperial ambition and that of the Zionist entities are not aligned. So he's now decided to directly intervene in this negotiations with Hamas in Doha with the help of Egypt and Qatar, but he's bypassing. He's not going through Tel Aviv when it comes to making this deal. He's informing Tel Aviv of what he may be doing, what he may be thinking, but he's not going directly to Tel Aviv as it's been for the last 19 months. I think there is a lot of pressure on the American administration, given that famine is at the brink in Gaza, if it's not there already. We've seen many children, adults are dying because of famine. And this is putting pressure on the American administration. It's also putting pressure on traditional Israeli allies in the West, France, the UK, and so on. So we've seen this misalignment, and now it's playing out. And Hamas is smelling, a potential ceasefire. Now, it does not mean that the ceasefire will happen today, tomorrow, next week, because this is the reason why when I issued the press statement, I said, do we now say who wags the dog? Is it the United States that call the shots, or is it the Israelis that call the shots in Washington? And if a ceasefire happens, we know that the Americans are the one in control. And if it doesn't happen, we know that Netanyahu will sabotage this, and it is the Israelis that control the show. And this will finally settle the question as to who controls who when it comes to this complex complex relationship between Israel and the United States.
I want to go back to your statement. It poses a very provocative metaphor, as you mentioned. Is it the dog that wags the tail, or the tail that wags the dog? In geopolitical terms, can we say, are we slowly witnessing a moment where Israel's autonomy, as you mentioned, is being overridden by American strategic interests? And most importantly, what kind of impact will that have? And how significant is this shift, especially focusing on this genocide in Gaza?
Yes, one must understand. I mean, we've always heard that Trump is a transactional president, and he wants to improve the American economy. And part of the negotiations when he went to the Middle East for his tour of Qatar, his tour of Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, was that he came back with over $3 trillion worth of deals, collectively in some way or another. However, perhaps now we can see that there's some room negotiations between Qatar, for example, especially to try to force a ceasefire, to make the ceasefire contingent upon rather make those deals contingent upon a ceasefire in Gaza. And perhaps that was a good stroke by the Qataris. We're speculating to some extent here, but perhaps this was behind the scenes negotiation, especially by Qatar, who hosts Hamas, who hosts the Taliban and other groups which the United States has negotiated with. And there is this misalignment. As I said at the beginning, the United States wants compliant regimes in the Middle East. Those regimes have no threat to Israel, but now this conflicts with the Greater Israel Project. For the benefit of your listeners, the Greater Israel Project is Israel is not content with just having, the West Bank, not having with Gaza and other parts of historic Palestine. It wants more. It wants to make this Greater Israel Project a reality, which means parts of Lebanon, which means parts of Syria, which means parts of Egypt, parts of Jordan, and even Saudi Arabia and Iraq. This is where the Greater Israel Project, and you would have noted during the Trump's campaign trail that he spoke about Israel being the small country, and Israel is very small. The entire Israel can fit into the Kruger National Park, to put it into perspective. And now these have clashed. America wants compliant Arab regimes. It's got compliant Arab regimes, but now those interests are misaligned and are conflicting with the interest of Israel, which wants to expand, which is now Trump is trying to put his foot down and to ensure that there is a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And this is what Hamas have said, and our contacts within Hamas have said that, it is not going to be although its first phase is a 70-day ceasefire in exchange for a few thousand, aid trucks a day and so on, but they will only sign if there are American guarantees, and they want a handshake with Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, and Khalil al-Hayya, who is heading Hamas's negotiating team. So they want it in front of the world, not some backdoor signature as they did the last time deal and so on. Now, and this is a good strategy by Hamas, because it makes sure that now the whole world sees Steve Witkoff's shaking Khalil al-Hayya's hand, and if they go renegade on this agreement, we'll know who broke the agreement, and it will be a PR nightmare for the United States. So at the moment, the situation is ripe for a ceasefire, but whether Netanyahu is able to sabotage this, and believe me, he's actively trying to sabotage it, and his right-wing goons, Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and others, whether they are able to put enough pressure on Netanyahu to sabotage this deal in one way or another, will ultimately determine, whether it is the tail that wags the dog or the dog that wags the tail.
Really, really like that one. I want us now to talk about the role of resistance. Given that Hamas has managed to survive months of all-out bombardment and targeting by the Israeli occupying forces, even having some of their key leaders being murdered, essentially. Is this potential deal a signal that they have forced a political acknowledgement of their legitimacy, or maybe at least their permanence on the international stage?
I think, that permanence, has been around for very long. The United States acknowledged that Hamas is a force to reckon with when it decided to negotiate directly with Hamas, even though it does not recognize Hamas. In fact, it recognizes Hamas as a terrorist grouping, yet it decided to go against that and to directly negotiate it with Hamas. What we must understand is that Hamas is not a traditional guerrilla movement, a resistance movement. Whilst it has a command structure, remember, it's lost everyone. Mohammed Daif, Yahya Sinwar, even those in the diaspora, Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in Iran. It has lost all its, and even reports that, which are not verified, but even Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar's brother, who was the next in charge, has also been assassinated. Yet the resistance continues. It continues even in areas which are so-called liberated by the Israelis. In the north, in Jabalia, yesterday it killed a number of Israeli soldiers. So Hamas does not need traditional leadership, and I think it had this strategy in mind even before it undertook October 7th special military operation, Tufan al-Aqsa. Before it undertook that operation, it understood that Israel is going to kill all its leaders. It knew that, even those in the diaspora. They knew it, and they were prepared to make that sacrifice. And they know that they have enough fighting personnel. They've actively recruited during the course of the war, the course of the genocide, rather. They've actually recruited, and they're able to train those who they've recruited simultaneously whilst fighting on other fronts. So they've constructed their own legitimacy. They've made themselves a force to be reckoned with. Don't be surprised soon, even if the Israelis acknowledge that. I mean, the Americans have said long time ago that Hamas cannot be defeated. Okay, even if you kill all Hamas soldiers, Hamas is an ideology. Israel has even said that even within Israel, they understand that Hamas, within its military leadership, that Hamas cannot be defeated. It's an ideology, and it's an ideology of liberation. And now that we've seen the Americans directly negotiating with it, has isolated Netanyahu. And, the resistance will continue. We're in a bit of a dormant stage where resistance continuing very strategically, because the Hamas understands that they cannot compete with F-16 and F-35 fighter jets and Merkava tanks and quadcopters and all of this military hardware, the latest military hardware in the region. They cannot directly, so they are engaging very strategic battles on certain fronts and then retreating back into the tunnels to regroup and to re-strategize. So we're in that phase of the war, and this can go on for very, very long, and Americans know that. So which is why, again, we see this misalignment between American and Israeli interests, and which is why we see a potential ceasefire. And I must say potential, because we cannot be certain. Ultimately, whether we see one or not, as I mentioned a few times now, depends on who calls the shots in Washington.
I want to touch on some of the terms, of this, negotiations. There are talks of, 10 live captives and 16 bodies being exchanged, for a ceasefire deal, essentially. What does it say, about the international order when you have 10 live captives and 16 bodies being exchanged for thousands of political prisoners and food aid coming into Gaza? I mean, just looking at the scales, it's a bit mind-boggling, eh?
Yeah, I think what we must understand is that international law, as people like to frequently refer to it over the last 20 months, whatever it entails, is dead. In fact, it was never alive to begin with. I've always said this, that international law was constructed to stop another Holocaust of Jews. It was not meant for everyone else. It was not meant for Africans. It was not meant for Muslims. It was not meant for those in Latin America. Remember, what we must understand is that international law was, the Holocaust was a genocide against white Europeans. Okay? So they had to construct a regime to ensure that white Europeans are not massacred again. So now we have a situation where, brown and Semitic people, Arabs, are being attacked and being subjected to another Holocaust. In Gaza, now they have to put up a pretension that international law is for everybody. Well, it was never meant for everybody, in my opinion. I've said this on a number of platforms. So now we have this, 1,000 prisoners for 10 live hostages and 16 murdered hostages. And we must note that they were not murdered by Hamas, but they were murdered by their own government through, relentless bombings and so on. So what does it say about international law? International law is dead. In fact, in my opinion, it was never alive to begin with.
And I think we're going to leave it on that very, very powerful note, Dr. Chesabai. Thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure and very, very, insightful talking to you right here on Salam Media. And I hope we catch up again. Really appreciate it.
Shukran. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
There you go. That was Dr. Ahmed Chesabai, researcher at the Media Review Network and also lecturer at UNISA. And yeah, very, very interesting conversation. The US once again in a so-called peace broker. But is the brokering peace that's happening, that we're witnessing, or buying time, for a strategic ally? While Hamas speaks from the rubble and Israel remains curiously sidelined, the question that we must ask is this a victory of resistance or maybe a recalibration of empire? And more crucially, when will justice, not just a ceasefire, become a global demand? Eh? if thousands of Palestinians can be traded for a handful of soldiers who I think by law can be captured, what does that say about the value of life under occupation for the people of Gaza? Literally, thousands and thousands of Palestinians. You want basic human rights and necessities to survive. You want water, you want food, you want medicine. Then release those 16 guys and 10, well, 16 dead bodies essentially, and 10 soldiers that have been captured. Because is this really a victory of resistance again, or a recalibration of empire? And when are we going to start asking for justice? Granted, ceasefire is there, it's needed. The people of Gaza need some sort of reprieve. It's been a long couple of months for them. But what about justice? What about justice for those that have lost their lives? What about justice for the babies that will never grow into adults? Justice for young people, youth who we have spoken to on this show, who have essentially lost out on being young and living a normal life that we all enjoy. What about those that have lost their land and their homes in the Nakba? So do we just call it a ceasefire and everyone goes their separate ways, and the people of Gaza rebuild again, only to be targeted again, only to have Gaza flattened out again? Because that's what's going to happen if there's no restitution, if there's no justice for the people of Gaza. What do you think? What do you think is more important? Should we just consider the fact that there's a ceasefire? The bombs have went silent. For a moment, the children won't be dying under the rubble. Or must we start questioning what's the bigger, broader picture when it comes to justice? Reparations? Or is that question too far off? We're not even there yet to not even, entertain the idea. Because I'm thinking surely there must be some kind of justice. But again, we can't, put the proverbial cart before the horse. There's a ceasefire that's needed right now. There are humanitarian corridors that need to be opened right now, because people are dying in Gaza. You can tell us what you think. You can engage with us on our various social media lines. Our CEO line is 0116800355. And our WhatsApp line is 0617660355. You can comment on our various social media pages using the handle hashtag news and views on Salam Media. And we can interact and, chew the proverbial cud on this issue. But we're going to take a quick break for now. After that, we'll be heading over to Uganda, where there are interesting developments as we also hone in on what's happening on the continent of Africa. News and views continues after this. Shap, shap.